This is Harlech, famous for its castle and its song, March of the Men of Harlech. This is Nozva. It means haven or refuge. It was built as an asylum for retired quarry workers. Here on the 26th of June 1903 was born Margaret More. When we were children, she used to point up to the little pointed window in the gable end of this house and say, "I was born in that room." In 1892, William Henry More, my grandfather, was appointed Crown Receiver for Wales and Monmouthshire. That means he was responsible for all the Crown land in the Principality. And he travelled a great deal, collecting rents, looking after Crown property, and of course local tenants of Crown property would come here and pay their rents at the Crown Office, which is a room in this building. In 1903, the Crown built this house specifically for him and his work. And it was in this house that my mother, her two sisters and three brothers grew up. William Henry More, my grandfather, came from Holloway, London, with his wife Alice Bensley and their three small children, Connie, Jack and Frank. A fourth child, Evelyn, was born in 1897. Margaret, or Peggy as she was known, was the fifth child in a family of 6 children. A sixth child, George, baby George, as he was called, was Peggy's favourite. She was devoted to him. When elder sister Connie married a widower, Captain Willie Lyne, with a child of 7 called Peter. He was the same age as baby George, and these 3 children, Peter, George, and Peggy, became inseparable friends. They shared the same nannies, the same pets, the same games, and the same pranks. Peggy was a tomboy. She and her gang was often in trouble. This was Peggy's childhood home. Peggy was asked by her governess to write a composition called "The View from My Window."
From my window I am able to see the sea and all that thereon is, which is never much. It is not the big open sea, but an inlet of the Atlantic Ocean, and it has never enormous white waves, as I should like, but still it is the sea, and I have a lovely view of it. It is by no means a busy bay, not being very deep, and the only sailing craft ever seen on it are little Welsh fishing smacks, a small coal boat from up the estuary, and occasionally a trawler, but it is because of the wildness that I love it.
Under W.H. Moore's supervision, the rocky hillside was turned into a superb garden. This was Peggy's childhood world. Her hero was Robin Hood. She prowled about this garden with a bow and a quiver full of arrows. On one occasion, the gardener's boy turned up for work in a pair of new trousers made out of a material then comparatively unknown. It was corduroy, and when he walked, it made a most unpleasant grating sound. Peggy took objection to that sound, aimed an arrow at the boy's rear end, and scored a bullseye.
Your mother, I remembered her because we called her Peggy More. She was a teenager in the town at the time, you see. And we used to see them all in church on Sunday morning. And I must say this, because church on Sunday morning was actually a fashion parade, especially in the summer months, when lots of the English people who owned houses in Harlech came down for their school holidays and so on. So there was quite a parade on Sunday mornings, you know. But the local people, many of them loved Crown Lodge because it was a special place in the town. And many of the people worked there as servants and gardeners and so on, you see. It is a special memory I have.
The More children ran wild in a land of extraordinary and magical beauty. The sea, the beach, sand dunes. One of the greatest figures in Margaret More's childhood was George Davison. He was an old school friend of her father. They had been young civil servants together, but then George went into business with the American photographic tycoon Eastman. He became director of Eastman's European operations at a time when the invention of celluloid film suddenly made photography accessible to all. George Davison became a millionaire. W.H. Moore persuaded him to settle in Harlech in 1907. He built an immense mansion, now Coleg Harlech, called Wen Vawr. Davison was a controversial figure, a great philanthropist, an intellectual benefactor of worthy causes. Other intensely creative people began to settle in Harlech. Poets, composers, scholars, artists. Joseph Holbrook, Eugene Goossens, Cyril Scott and Granville Bantock. The traditions continue to this day. The Royal St. David's Golf Club, founded below the town by W.H. Moore and Harold Henny H. Finch Hatton in 1895, attracted many visitors, which added to the cultural life of Harlech. The music of Margaret More was inspired very much by the superlative scenery, the landscapes, the skyscapes, and most especially the ever-changing and restless sea. In the cultural hothouse of Edwardian Harlech, her musical awakening took place. This photograph shows her awakening to some kind of musical impulse. "I hear the bell" is the caption. Her mother was a competent pianist and much in demand at country house parties. So was her elder brother Jack. In those days, Crown Lodge resounded with their piano duets. The natural genius of the Welsh people for music found expression in Harlech in the annual festivals in the castle. These drew thousands from all over Wales. Peggy's governess, Miss Carter, detected her talent and promoted it, hoping she would become a concert pianist. When the composer, Joseph Holbrook, settled in Harlech to work on his masterpiece drama from the Welsh mythology, The Cauldron of Anwin, he gave Margaret lessons and encouragement. At the age of 15, Margaret More was signing her name Peg Morewski, and in the family magazine appeared Peeps into the Future. Her first compositions were published when she was 17. In her first photograph album, there's no question of the career she saw for herself. Peggy was 11 when the First World War broke out. Crown Lodge became a recruiting station. Her two elder brothers, Jack and Frank, enlisted. Her brother-in-law, Willie Lyne, was called back into the Navy. Her sister Evelyn went to London and became a VAD in a Red Cross hospital. Peggy was old enough to feel intensely involved, but too young to do anything useful. When the armistice was proclaimed, Peggy took the Crown Lodge dinner gong and beat it loudly all over Harlech. But what of her musical career? She had a row with her parents over the amount of time devoted by her governess to music. She threw her music on the fire and cut off her hair. There was no money to send her to her music college, and women couldn't vote. The frustration shows in this photograph. She was outspoken and rude. She gave offence to Lady Stepney, to whom brother Frank was agent. Guinevere was Frank's wife, and she did much to direct her activities. Peggy More was the first woman in North Wales to ride a motorbike. The first time she drove a car was to carry an old woman who had had a stroke from a remote mountain farm to hospital. On another occasion, this time driving a 3-wheel Morgan, she took a corner so fast that the car turned over. Crawling out from underneath, Peggy and her brothers were covered in what they thought was oil, but it turned out to be a tin of black treacle fractured in the accident. The first tennis racket I ever owned was my mother's. It had a gash in the handle from this crash. For a time, drama absorbed her activities. The great opportunity came with the Harlech pageant of 1921. It aroused nationwide interest because the Prime Minister's family took part. Dame Margaret Lloyd-George played the part of Lady Glendower, and her daughter Meghan played Lady Mortimer. Peggy More played the part of a man, Prince Edward of Lancaster, son of Margaret of Anjou. The Prime Minister attended in person. After the performance, he turned to Prince Edward and said, "Well done, my boy." In 1923, Peggy's energies went into founding the first Girl Guide Company in Harlech. Their first headquarters was an ancient stone dwelling below the place, once occupied by Oliver Cromwell. This was the first day in uniform at Crown Lodge.
There were about 6 in each patrol. Red Rose and the White Heather patrol and the Thistle patrol. And I happened to be the leader of Red Rose patrol. We used to go out every Saturday and make a lovely campfire and fry our sausages and things there. And then we'd dance round the campfire and we used to sing the Chestnut Tree.
Small girls from Harlech had their first experience of campfires and sleeping under canvas. Her guide company attended weekend camps at Cross Foxes and Hriech. The Harlech Brownie Pack singing, "3 times round went our gallant ship." This one is entitled "The Pipers," "Gruffy Gruffy," and "More Camp Kitchen."
Mother had a very funny story about the guides when the Baden-Powells came, because Lady Baden-Powell did an inspection of all the tents at this jamboree, and it was all quite nice, you know. And she went to the last tent, it was absolutely impeccable. Everything right by the side of the pillow and the laid out kit and everything, there was powder compact and an apple. And Lady Baden-Powell, looking at it, came out and she said, "All I see in that tent is vanity and greed."
Somebody had to do the washing up. Peggy is smiling. But these were sad and difficult years. Her brothers and sisters had married and left home. Brother George went to India. Her mother fell ill with an incurable nervous affliction. Peggy had spent a short time in London, 1 hour a week at the Royal College of Music, but her mother's condition grew worse. As always, when assailed by sorrow, she turned to music. In 1928, she began to write an opera and organized local talent to perform it.
She had a music room upstairs.
Yes.
So we used to go there and
Yes.
spend our time with her. And she had a piano and everything there.
What sort of music was she writing then? I mean, how were you involved in that?
Well, I think she was busy starting on The Little Mermaid.
Yes,
You see, it took her some time
yes.
to write that music.
There is a fragment of cine-film of this period, probably made by her younger brother George. It is Harlech Beach, about 1928. Elder brother Jack, his new bride Gaynor, Peggy and another gentleman no one can identify. It certainly is not Raymond Bantock, her future husband, but he comes into the picture very shortly.
Your mother came to Miss Peggy More and then came to the school and asked the headmaster, could Dudley Maidman come out and help and blow the organ for this special organist that come down from London. And I remember I had to go and pump the organ, because now it's all electrical, isn't it?
So you missed school for a day or two?
Oh no, it was only about an hour and a half. Your mother gave me £50. I thought it was a lot of money in them days. Lot of money in them days.
Raymond wrote to his parents, "Dear Mother and Daddy, just a line to tell you that Miss Peggy More and I are engaged to be married, and that I hope you will find her an affectionate and loving daughter." Raymond and Peggy had first met at the home of Joseph Holbrook in Harlech. He was an old friend of Granville Bantock, Raymond's father. It was a fashionable wedding in Harlech Church. It received full coverage in the local press. In this house, her 5 sons were born. Music was forced to take a back seat. There's a newspaper interview with Margaret More around about 1931, when she refers to art with a little a and family with a capital F. and how much she admired Sybil Thorndike for combining the two so successfully. The composer father-in-law took some interest in her work. Peggy's father, W.H. More, died in 1934, and Crown Lodge was returned to the Crown. But 3 years before that, Raymond Bantock had acquired Traethdy. It means the house on the beach. Whenever possible, Peggy took her children to Traethdy. The 5 little Bantock boys were called the Men of Harlech. The family was on holiday at Traethdy in September 1939 when the Second World War broke out. Margaret More had had no formal education, but when crowds of families arrived from London, escaping from the bombing, there was a need to educate them, and so she began a little school to educate the children of evacuated families. She organized for them campfires, trekking, and used the experience that she had learned from the Girl Guide movement. Their only daughter, Lucy, was born in May 1942.
And she composed round there. She had a little dulcitone, which came to her from her father-in-law.
This is the dulcitone that Mother used when she was composing through the war years at Traethdy. Very rare instrument. And at that time she was sleeping in an annex on the very wind, weather-exposed side of this little chalet on the dunes. And in spite of all her family cares, all her small children, she went on composing, sometimes right through the night, fortified with Will's woodbines and endless pots of tea, and wouldn't reappear until noon the next day. The time after the Second World War were difficult years. The family moved back to Birmingham. This was a time of post-war austerity. With 6 children all at school at the same time, the pressures were enormous. Then tragedy struck. Her 4th son, Merwyn, was struck down with polio. After 3 years almost totally paralyzed, 1957, age 19. Yet these years were musically the most productive. The best was born of hardship, suffering, and loneliness. Peggy wrote music for a light opera called The Snow Queen, based on the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. The lyrics were written by Michael Martin Harvey, son of Sir John Martin Harvey, the celebrated Edwardian actor. Martin Harvey also made the costumes, of which these models were the prototypes. It was performed in the Children's Theatre, Johannesburg, in 1948. Her greatest triumph was in 1951, the year of the Festival of Britain. The Barfield Grand Opera Society, with the Birmingham Philharmonic Orchestra, put on her opera, The Mermaid, some 20 years after it was written.
But The Mermaid, second woman in Britain ever to write a grand opera, that is, there's no spoken word in it, every word is sung. So, I mean, there was this huge ambition there. What I'd like to do is to say a few words about The Mermaid before actually playing any of the music. In the early 1920s, Margaret More moved to London, where she went to music college. She had exactly 1 hour's tuition a week, and I think she was very lonely a lot of the time. She never liked London. But she did meet a fellow student, Tommy Grigg, who was a girl, and through Tommy Grigg she met Claudine Curry, a poetess. Claudine Curry had adapted one of Hans Andersen's fairy tales for operatic setting. This was called The Little Sea Maid, although they always called it The Mermaid.
Here we see Bernard Dudley on the left, the producer. Centre, David Ludlow, the conductor. Michael Martin Harvey designed the sets and costumes. "How shall we dress the grandmother?" he asked the composer as they walked along Harlech Beach together. "With that," said Margaret, kicking a large spider crab's shell. And so a shell, a scallop, was attached to some seaweed and was the breastplate of the grandmother. Eileen Merle played the lead.
You remember that the mermaids are never seen. Apart from a lady, the mermaid's chorus, quite correctly, is only heard. But the nuns are seen, so the mermaids are singing off stage, dressed as nuns. And there was quite a lot of fun with the production because the nuns have those, what are they called, wimples or something, and you can't sing properly. So I was a stagehand, I used to go around undoing the nuns at the top so they could sing, but the costumer, Michael Martin Harvey, would go around tightening them up again to make them look a bit more like nuns. So there was a certain amount of interest there.
Harold Tomlinson, here centre, kneeling, played Merodach. Bernard Alker, standing at the back, was Prince Jürgen. Scene 11, his ship, with a mermaid on board. She had exchanged her voice for feet, so cannot explain that it was she who saved him from shipwreck.
Right, this is the finale of the Mermaid. She's got her voice back by kissing the knife that her sister got from the witch in exchange for her sister's hair. She realises that Jürgen is betrothed to Ingerild, the princess, so he's not for her. And Merodach appears. Right, a beautiful moment. Actually, I produced it quite well, golden light. And she sings, "You are the wind they dread, you are the fool they scorn, you are the soul I seek." Merodach thing, the later come, and they just get absorbed into the light together. And this is the music which finishes the opera.
Four performances were given, and a telegram was received from Sibelius. Consider honour to head list of patrons of Mrs. Raymond Bantock's opera Stop, warmest greetings, Jean Sibelius. The previous year, Margaret had visited Sibelius at Järvenpää in Finland with Raymond and their eldest son Robin. The link between the families goes back to the early years of the 20th century, when Granville Bantock did much to popularise the music of Sibelius in Britain. Sibelius visited Granville several times in Birmingham and dedicated his Third Symphony to him. Sibelius was then, in 1950, 84. Margaret wrote in her logbook,
Description of the man Sibelius himself is difficult. Despite his 84 years, his figure, in a cream serge suit, although naturally rather shrunken, gives the same impression of power one gets from pictures of him. He moves and walks with astonishing briskness. His square, completely shaven head is also powerful-looking still. But instead of that stern, awe-inspiring face one had expected, the expression is genial, and the deep-set, pale blue eyes sparkling with fun and kindliness. His welcome was one to old and valued friends. He addressed himself to me and said, "So you are a composer?" In reply, I could only hold up a hand with a finger and thumb an inch apart, but after asking what I had written and hearing of the opera, he held his hands wide apart. "You are a greater composer than I have no opera." After lunch, Sibelius gave me a cigarette, which, needless to say, I didn't smoke, and shall never smoke, and he asked me to play.
She played him the Mermaid's Chorus, Aleda's Dream of the Soul theme, and the lullaby she wrote for her daughter Lucy. To Raymond he gave a signed photograph. In Coronation year 1953, Margaret More wrote a marching song called Forward, which she dedicated to the city of Birmingham. Two of her sons were posed with her rather artificially at the piano. That is, of course, Robin, my brother, and myself. In her final years, 1955 to 66, she formed a group of singers called the Hans Andersen Players, which toured the country performing her works. These included The Nightingale, Punchinello, The Swineherd, the singers sitting round a table after the tradition of Hans Andersen himself.
Well, my memories of the time I spent with the Hans Andersen Players and your mother, who produced and composed the music, are one of the happiest times of my life. We were a very happy group, and the music absolutely thrilled us. We'd go to rehearsal of an evening, and we wouldn't know what your mother had composed for us until we got there, and then we'd be handed these pieces of music. And we'd try them, and there's never any anger or anything. It was just sheer joy every time. It was the highlight of every week to go to rehearsal.
On one occasion, the Players toured Denmark.
Well, that was very exciting. I think we sort of started by going to the Danish embassy in London, and then things started to happen. We performed there, and then they said, why don't you come over to Denmark? And suddenly it was all arranged, and your mother would be there, just a perfect lady. She really was, all the time, and the Danes really took her to their heart. We were treated like royalty. The soprano and I, Janet, were entertained in a palace. We spent 3 days there. We did sightseeing. It was a most wonderful moment of our lives. She would say, are you comfortable with this? And you'd say, well, it would be easy to sing a word on that note, or that's a little bit difficult. And she'd change it immediately. And she'd be so excited if you sang it the way she felt.
Yes.
She'd say, I feel this is like this, and if you could produce it. She was so grateful. But really, we should have been grateful to your mother, because she wrote for our voices, and how many singers have that privilege? There's not many.
No. The group continued to perform after her death under the direction of her youngest son, Gavin.
When she was a young woman and living in Harlem, sometimes she conducted orchestra. A very rare thing for a woman to do in those days, especially in Wales. But I heard one story about her. She used to tell that once when she was conducting an orchestra inside Harlem Castle, she suddenly let go of the baton. There's some very dramatic music. She suddenly let go of the baton and it went straight into the orchestra and pierced the thigh of one of the cellists. But anyway, quite late in life, maybe after she was 50 or even 55, my mother had been using a potato peeler many times, but only when she was as old as 50 or 55, she discovered that there's proper cutter part on the back of here. But until that time she'd been using the thick edge here for peeling potatoes. And I remember her amazement when she found this small part for cutting potato, peeling potatoes at the back of there. And she was very fond of driving and she was a very good driver. And I can remember the first time she ever drove over the speed of 60 miles an hour on a straight bit of road just before Shrewsbury. That was quite an epoch-making event to go when the needle crept over 60. Things are very different now. But actually Mother always used to say, I can drive car backwards better than forward. Just make that kind of job. There's one thing which also I remember about my mother when I was a boy. Sometimes fancy dress party at Harlech, maybe once or twice I can remember. She always dressed up as the old woman of the sea. She used to hang brown seaweed around her, from the go down to the beach and get some. And then she used to squeeze her nostrils together and like this, and then breathe in and show her teeth like this. I can't do it because my nostrils, but her nostrils would stick together when she did that, and sort of like that, but I can't do it now, they're stuck together. She showed her teeth, and then she said, I'm the old woman of the sea. And it was quite a memorable image. She was such a fun-loving person, full of wit and quaint turns of phrase. Here she is as one of the princes in our Christmas 1953 family show, The Princess and the Woodcutter. She did the Blue Prince as an ancient Welsh warrior.
Mother always dreamed of retiring to a Welsh cottage to write music. From the 1940s she began looking for one. At that time there were loads of them. At last one turned up rather closer than she expected. Mrs. Jones, farmer of Talorockin, Llanfair, sold her Hen Gaerfanon. Her niece, Mania Lewis, tells us how this happened.
Auntie Betty farmed Caerfanon and Talorockin, and she used to deliver milk down to Tracy. When I used to do a little bit of it as well. They met, and Auntie Betty didn't use Caerfanon except for churning and making the butter there, and then it came from that.
It was so derelict it required rebuilding almost from the foundations. Here she entertained her friends, wrote music, played Scrabble, and enjoyed her grandchildren, who still refer to her as Nine. But her time was running out. That extraordinary energy was burning itself up. Easter, 1966. Primrose time. Mother was back in hospital. The second time. She waved goodbye to Gavin, the last to see her alive, and died that night. It was Good Friday.
I think you knew you were dying. In hospital you told me, with a kind of happiness that never comes on ordinary days, of long drives over the Welsh moors in wartime, and once parking by a high wall at night to feed me, a baby in the back seat, and turning on for a moment the forbidden headlights, you saw not a protecting wall, but the vast, dark expanse of Barmouth history. There were so many tears at the end. Not in the last weeks, for then there were only calm smiles and huge eyes in a face daily thinner. I was the last of the family to see you alive. You lifted your hand and waved, just as you used to, cheerfully, briefly, full of an optimism, the source of which none of us will ever know.